Welcome to Session 5 of our Essentials course on the book of Ephesians. Today we will explore the third chapter of Paul's letter. Now, when you look at this chapter, I think it's helpful to divide the chapter into two parts. The first part of the chapter is autobiographical. The second part of the chapter is a prayer. So looking at the first part, Paul, as we've probably noticed as we've been reading him, he has a habit of going off at a word. Paul will write a word or a phrase which will take him off on a tangent. And these tangents are in God's providence or in some mysterious way actually used by God, so they're important. But this going off on a tangent, it happens at the beginning of our chapter today. Paul starts this way. He says, "This is the reason that I, Paul, am a prisoner for Christ Jesus for the sake of you Gentiles." Now, when Paul writes this line, the mention of his imprisonment, it sends him off on one of these tangents, and he begins to describe his own ministry, his own call, which involves his suffering, and at this time, his imprisonment, probably in Rome. He says he's a prisoner of Christ Jesus for their sake. So that's the first part of the chapter. Then at verse 14, Paul returns to his initial thinking, starting again with the same words from verse 1. He writes, "For this reason." Now the content of the second part of the chapter is a prayer. It's a prayer for the men and women who are receiving this letter, a prayer for those with whom he is sharing the gospel. And in this video, I want to focus on this second part of the chapter, on Paul's prayer. So let's begin at verse 14. Paul writes, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name." And then we have the prayer, and there are three petitions in the prayer. We'll look at each one. First petition, he writes, "I pray that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit." Strengthened in your inner being with power. One of the fundamental experiences of human life is that there is more than just the material world. That this world is only part of the story. Call it what you will, but I think all of us have an awareness or a sensitivity to a world of truth and power higher than ourselves. And so when Paul speaks of this inner being, he's alluding to this awareness. The inner being is a term that refers to our souls, our spiritual faculties. And so Paul prays here simply that these spiritual faculties that we have, that they are strengthened and invigorated by God. And notice, he says that they are strengthened through God's Spirit. God's Spirit does this work of strengthening. Now, why does he want these faculties to be strengthened? For what purpose? And that's the second petition. He says, "I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge." Paul wants our spiritual faculties strengthened so that we can comprehend the love of Christ. Comprehend is the key word there. This comprehending he's talking about, it's not comprehending in a cognitive sense with the mind. No, this is comprehending the love of Christ in the soul, to really feel it and know it at an existential or subjective level. In fact, Paul alludes to this when he says, to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. He's talking about heart knowledge here. He's praying for an inner experience in which God's love becomes as real to them as any other experience they may have had. And this love of Christ, he says it races outward in 4 different directions. It's so great. It surpasses knowledge, he says. If there's one question that you discuss in your group today, I encourage you to talk about what it means to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, to know it in your heart. Love, by its nature, can only be understood by the heart. And so how do we know this love of Christ? So, Paul prays that their spiritual faculties are strengthened so that they may know the love of Christ. And then we have our third and last petition. It's verse 19. He says, so that, may these things be true, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. To be filled with the fullness of God. Sounds pretty good. It may help you to know that this language, the fullness of God, it refers to perfection, to being brought to fulfillment, the fullness of who we were created to be. We were meant to live lives in deep relationship with God, to participate in His very life. That's what human flourishing looks like, to live our lives in relationship with God and to be filled with His fullness. One of the things that strikes me about this prayer, looking at the entire prayer, is the fact that life in first century Ephesus, it was not easy. You had warfare, you had disease, you had threat of famine, not to mention all the internal problems they had, same things we struggle with, shame, fear, anger, depression, anxiety. These people had big problems and they had big needs. They struggled like everyone else, and Paul knew this. But when Paul looked at their lives, and when he prayed for them, he prayed for one thing. Paul prayed for the experience of God, that the love of Christ would be poured into their hearts. You see, he prayed this because he believed that that is what they really needed. Not that their other problems didn't matter, but Paul knew that if they had this experience, this kind of heart knowledge, then they could make it through. They could overcome. And that's true of us today. And so again, I encourage you to talk in your group. How have you experienced the love of Christ in your life? This love that Paul prays for each one of us.